Do you ever get confused when reading academic articles or books? Maybe even get overwhelmed by the amount of information? I know I did when I was first starting my doctoral program, and still sometimes today. That's ironic, since academic writing is all about making sense out of disparate facts, giving structure to information, and providing interpretations. So the problem may be with us as readers. We get bogged down trying to remember all the information that is new. So here's something to remember. There will always be time for you to reread and memorize that information in time once you discern what is important for you to memorize. But to read scholarly writing efficiently and effectively in order to use it, you need to understand how academic writing is structured. Once we understand that academic writing is generally structured around a thesis and argument, we can practice reading in a way that is time efficient and serves us better in our research. This short video is intended to guide you through some steps in gaining more confidence in reading and writing in academic fields. Take a look at the photograph of tangerines. Just as the two bowls placed one inside the other contain all the tangerines and allow them to be presented in an aesthetically pleasing way, academic writing uses containers, or academic disciplines, to bring structure and, yes, even aesthetically pleasing arrangements to information and theories that would otherwise be a mere jumble. Academic research, writing, and speaking are all about imposing structures in order to make meaning. In other words, we impose structure in order to interpret and analyze the world around us. This image shows a work in progress of a doctoral student who is writing her dissertation. You can see the beginning of structure with the columns and the color coding, can't you? But there is still a ways to go before she was able to articulate in a clear thesis statement and argument the interpretation she would eventually pose. Now, I start by showing you a work in progress because we might think scholars know what they're going to write from the very beginning. But in fact, research begins from a place of not knowing. Research begins with a question, and it usually requires a lot of trial and error, drafts and redrafts to arrive at a satisfactory answer, which is your thesis statement. All academic research begins with a question, specifically an analytical question that poses a problem that will require analysis and interpretation of sources to solve. Often that question begins with the words how or why. The scholar then researches that problem using both previous scholarship that's related to the question and then the raw data or the evidence that's used to solve the problem. When someone has arrived at an answer to the analytical question, that answer is the thesis statement. The more precise a thesis, the easier it is for readers to identify it and remember it. A thesis is a statement that someone can argue against. So when an author states their thesis, they are taking a stand that needs to be demonstrated. It's not an inarguable fact, it's an interpretation. The argument is how the author demonstrates that the thesis is accurate through evidence from both primary and secondary sources. Because a thesis is something against which someone can argue, scholars need to prove and demonstrate that their claim is valid. They do that by providing evidence and presenting that evidence in a way that constructs an argument to convince the reader of the validity of the claim. So just to repeat, the thesis statement is not a fact. It involves interpretation. By stating a thesis, the scholar takes a stand and then backs it up with an argument. If the argument is of interest or is provocative, other scholars will then enter into a conversation with that scholar by way of critique. Let's look at some of this schematically. You'll see at the center here the thesis and argument, which we've just explained. Feeding into how that thesis and argument are structured are, on the left, academic disciplines. Those are the containers I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Another way of thinking of academic disciplines is to consider them as communities of scholars. On the right are the sources, both primary sources, that is the raw data, the evidence, the material that's being interpreted, and the secondary sources, otherwise known as the previous scholarship on the subject that provides the context of scholarship. Another way of thinking of secondary sources is to consider them as being written by people in that community, i.e. the disciplines, and that they're actually having conversations with one another. Let's just talk about academic disciplines for a minute. The academy is broken down into academic disciplines. We see this in the various departments at a college or a university, and we see this in the disciplines that make up a theological degree: history, scripture, ethics, systematic theology, liturgical studies, just to name a few. Scholars tend to write and talk within the same discipline. That is, we write generally for colleagues who work within the same discipline or similar disciplines. It's similar to speaking the same language. We understand scholars who work from the same set of analytical principles. Now, it's true, interdisciplinary studies have made great inroads in breaking down what can be seen as barriers to communication across disciplines. But it's not true that an interdisciplinary approach is more right than one that's embedded in a discipline. There are advantages and insights in all approaches, and all approaches are subject to critique. Students often ask me, where can I find the thesis statement? Now, most scholars state their thesis in the introduction and or in the conclusion of their work. In a book-length study, you should pay very close attention to the beginning of the introduction and the very end of the introduction, where the chapter map is. That is where the scholar is laying out the sequence of chapters, which is another way of letting you know how they're going to present their argument. Most writers will also state their thesis again in their conclusion after they've presented all their evidence. Now, just to keep you on your toes, and frankly, this can be frustrating, some theses are deeply embedded in the narrative of a text. Now, this is especially true for textbooks, which can be one of the most challenging genres of academic writing to analyze, precisely because they're written for students to accept and memorize the content at face value. So, rather than starting this practice of identifying the thesis and argument with a textbook, try practicing on a relatively short article, especially if it has an abstract at the beginning, or find a book or series of books that have been published for a while so that there are book reviews out there that you can read. When reading, discussing, and researching, it's helpful if you can commit to memory the thesis and argument of the scholars you're reading. Committing to memory the name of the author, the title of the work, and the thesis and argument might require that you actually rehearse speaking out loud. If that's what it takes, then do it. For some of us, it requires that we write and rewrite the names and the thesis and argument over and over again. If that's how you learn material, then do it. Write and rewrite. I can pretty much guarantee that you cannot just cut and paste from a document and think that you will remember this valuable information. Our minds just don't work that way. It's best if you can put the time and effort to restate the thesis and argument in your own words and take the time and effort to commit that to memory. This will allow you to participate in conversations with other scholars. It'll also allow you to see more readily where your own contribution will fit in when you begin to write and publish. Now, students also ask me, how can I be sure that I've stated the thesis correctly? Well, some authors are very helpful and actually write in their books and articles something like, in this book, I will argue blah, blah, blah. But sometimes that doesn't happen. If you're reading an academic book, you can, as I've just mentioned, read book reviews in academic journals. Read a few reviews of the same book. One of the jobs a reviewer has is to state the thesis and argument. So you can actually train yourself to identify the thesis and argument by reading book reviews. While you're still in coursework, if you're having trouble identifying a thesis and an argument in assigned secondary sources, ask during class or ask the professor in office hours. And finally, while you're still working closely with faculty on your dissertation, ask them for assistance. Above all, try to practice stating the thesis and argument. And remember, if you start off by saying something like, well, this book is about, well, you're heading down the path of description rather than analysis. I encourage you to cultivate the habit of starting off saying something more like this. This author, and frankly, it's best to state the author's name, Darlene Prides argues blah, blah, blah. Be able to state succinctly and directly the claim that the author makes. Once you hone your skills at reading analytically, that is, reading for thesis and argument, you'll find that you'll be able to read much more efficiently. You don't need to read every page of every book. You can understand the contribution of a book and an article by assessing its claim, that is the thesis, and how that claim is demonstrated. That's the argument. Now, to help you in all of this, I've created a template for analyzing secondary sources that will prompt you to consider and analyze the components of an article or book that involves a thesis and argument. If you are studying with me or taking a course with me, chances are you will already have access to this template in the course materials. If you're not studying with me but would like to use this template or at least take a look at it, you can find it on my academia.edu page. So to conclude, I wish you good luck with all of this. Just keep practicing and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or suggestions for further videos. You can reach me by email.